Dave, thanks for being willing to do this interview. Tell us about yourself in the beginning. How did you become a believer of Jesus?
I grew up in a household where I went to church just because in that era of America, good Americans went to church. It's what they did. But my dad was not particularly a believer in Jesus. My mom was, but hadn't been to church in many years. And they took my sister and me to a denominational church, which we did not like and had a bad experience and ultimately rebelled against. But when I went to college, for the last few years before that, I was a very intense kid, and I would debate Christians about why they believe what they believe. I would pick fights with them. And so from that posture of largely being known as the atheist in my circle, I just began to have a crisis of what my life was going to be about. Now that I was in college, where was my life headed? And I couldn't figure out how to cheer up. And so one day I decided to pray, and kind of uncanny things seemed to happen that night, which at least got me thinking, gee, I wonder if there's something going on out there. I pursued that, just going out and saying to the universe, hey, universe, seemed like something happened when I prayed. And through that process, I became pretty persuaded there was something going on out there. And since I was in college, I studied a bit about religion, and I found people who could take me to various religious services, mostly Christian, but not all. And after about 2 years, it was pretty clear to me it was about Jesus.
Wow. You had a connection to Jesus at some point. How do you see people connecting to God, secular people trying to connect to God?
My experience has been, having pastored a church in a very, very secular place, is that people want what I would call God. Everyone does. But they just have to know how to make that transition. They have some objections, but what they most want is to know, if there's a real God that I can actually experience, how do I do it? And so I think the mistake, at least in America, people often make from a church side is thinking they have to argue people into God. I have a better case. I'll prove it to you. In my experience, that's never worked with one person ever under any circumstance. Instead, what people I find are asking is more how to. If there's something real up there, how do I get it? And can I get it? And so we try to help people do that, and many people have.
How can a church be helpful in connecting non-Christians to God in the way that you just described?
I think if churches think about hospitality kind of profoundly, almost like you're at a dinner party, and you were thinking about inviting people who are both your best friends for 40 years, and they believe everything you believe, and they've been buddies with you, and they know all your stories, and also inviting to the same party someone you just met that day who seems like a lovely person, and their family's going to come over too, and you're all in the same room, and you're going to try to throw a great event where people can really get to know each other, both your close friend and your new friend and you. Somehow that analogy to me applies to churches, that if you can imagine those are the people you have in your congregation at that time, what do you want to do with them? Not to change anything. You want a great meal. You want it to be rich, good food. I think people who think about that do well. And I think that actually changes our mindset about how we do music, how we talk to people, how we even interpret what we want to say. We tidy up a bit when we're going to have that sort of party over. How should our setting look like? All those things we found to be very helpful to think about.
Okay. So you mentioned you were a pastor for several years. After years of pastoring, now you're heading up a new ministry. Tell us about that.
It's a ministry with the name of Blue Ocean Faith. And what I discovered in pastoring was we were pastoring in a very, very secular place, about 2% church going. And in America, that was actually kind of unusual. And so we wondered, were there other people who had similar circumstances as we did? And we grew very big. So our church grew very big, largely with people who had not been churchgoers in the past. And we just recognized we had a whole different set of assumptions than our friends who were pastoring in places where lots of people went to church. And so that just got us talking to other people who were pastoring churches where nobody went to church, just about. What did they learn? And so we started a little network of swapping stories and figuring out what happened in those settings. And we found out there was a lot of interest in that. So pretty soon we threw one gathering, just letting people know this existed just through personal networks, no advertising. And people from about half of America, about 25 states, showed up. So it's lots of interest. Suddenly, the last gathering we had people from South Africa, from Japan. I think there's a hunger to figure out how can you thrive in places that are not already very church-going.
Okay, wow. Why is it so difficult for churches and Christians to go after the Blue Ocean to do ministry there?
I think we all live in a place where We're around people who think the way we do because that's what human beings do. We like being around people who kind of are on our same page. Going to a place where people are not church going, if we are church going and grew up that way, it's almost two different worlds. And so I think for many of us, recognizing that we can kind of get out of our own way, and that these people we meet, if we're a churchgoer, who are not churchgoers, are lovely, thoughtful people who have a lot to contribute to our life, and figuring out ways to learn to be more transparent, not more tactical. We've got some strategy we're working with them, but just more open. And then being open to what they have to give us, we've just seen tremendously helpful things happen for Jesus and for churches through just that simple step.
Okay. Here's a spontaneous question, like, what role does, in what you described, what role does hearing the voice of God play? Like when you do that, do you just do it like after a system, or something that you read in a book, or are you in connection? And if yes, then how?
So is your question, how do I recommend people to listen to God, or what role does it play in reaching a secular world?
I think, like, what role does it play when hearing the voice of God and doing what He says and what you just described, in like aiming at that?
People that I meet in churches and outside of churches want an actual encounter with God. It's a deeply desired thing. And so the more we can help people connect with the actual God in a way that satisfies them, that was God, it's a win for everybody. And that usually involves hearing God's voice. Mm-hmm. And so it's crucial, in my experience, both for longtime churchgoers to be happy for the long term, and it's crucial for people exploring faith from outside of churches. If there's a God they can actually hear who's real to them personally, it's a home run. That's what they're looking for.
Wow. So now I met people who like understand what it means to hear God's voice, and they have a concept of that, and they say, I think I hear God's voice, or very like I do hear God's voice. And others who might be even following Jesus, and say, I'm not sure if I do. Like, what advice would you give them?
I often advise people to start, and that the way I've seen people succeed when they start is sort of childlike. It's talking to God and trying to be still enough to think, I wonder if God's talking back. And so literally it's taking 5 minutes a day and saying, hey God, how's it going? And you think, I wonder if God just said, I'm doing fine, thank you. Think, oh really? And maybe God said, and how are you? And you think, well, you could say, well, actually, I'm not doing so fine. I have all these problems. And you lay them out and you think, do you have any thoughts on them? And maybe did God say, oh, I do have a few thoughts on them, Dave. Here's what they are. It's a childlike kind of like a game almost that you're playing. And the question people always ask is, okay, I might be willing to do that, but how do I know that whatever these impressions I get that might be answers are God as opposed to just my own thoughts? And the key helpfulness to me has been a passage in the Bible in James chapter 1 that says, if you want to hear what God wants you to do, ask God and He'll tell you. He promises to, but don't doubt. And so to me, that advice seems to say that we have to just get started and hold all our questions and skepticism in abeyance for a while, keep the conversation going, and do it for a few weeks, and in small chunks. I have found for hundreds and hundreds of people just starting and stopping the question, how do I know that's God's voice and not my voice, just leaving that alone for just a few weeks, a rhythm gets set that's really powerful, and that people become quite persuaded. Oh, I can tell the difference.
So you mentioned earlier that everybody's sort of longing for God. Mm-hmm. What do you think, what's the meaning of life, Dave?
I have found the meaning of life to be, this will sound simplistic, connection. That I think what people are looking for is connection to people. I think they're looking for connection to themselves in ways they often feel cut off by. And maybe it's because of my background. I think they're looking for connection to God or to meaning or to the universe, depending how broad you want to go. And I think I've found that if you can find a way to get a conversation going on what gets you up in the morning, what's worth living for, if your best case scenario worked out in your life, what would that be? That's a good conversation, because people rarely go there and rarely are able to connect with other people about that. It's too private. But if they can find a way where it's safe and helpful, people suddenly get ideas from hearing each other's answers to that question, which sparks them, which gives a deeper conversation, and which in my experience goes to a really good place. From my perspective, it goes to Jesus pretty quickly. From a secular person's perspective, maybe that's not the way they would phrase it, but boy, it sure seems powerful.
So it seems like you're having a lot of conversations with people, and I know that you have a background as a writer. How does that help you in your conversations, or maybe even your ministry and doing pastoring, connecting to people, speaking? How does being a writer help you do that?
I wrote fiction and I wrote plays, and so fiction writers think a lot about stories. What makes a story? What's compelling in stories? Why do people listen to stories? Stories are also about meaning. Stories are about connection usually, and stories so much of the Bible, right? That's how God seemed to have wanted to tell us the deepest things were through stories. And so I think being a writer who's given some attention to how communication works, how story works, has been at least a really useful skill set for me to bring to the table, and for friends of mine who have a similar skill set.
Well, and so if somebody would come and ask you that, my story, that it doesn't have any meaning, and I am looking for connection, what would you tell them to start?
I would tell them to start wherever they were. And so they could either start by just actually trying to figure out how to have deeper conversations with their friends. That if they could figure out how to do that and be open about who they were and what their questions were, and invite their friends to be open about who they were, I've seen really good things happen there, because again, very few people do that. And so if you can find a way to do that, you're actually on a track of sorting some things out. If they're a spiritual person or open to being a spiritual person, I would probably encourage them to do whatever their spirituality suggests. So if they were able to say, I mean, in my case, what I basically said is, God, this is literally the first prayer I prayed. God, I don't believe you exist. But on the off chance that I'm wrong, today would be a great day to tell me. Amen. And I had all sorts of helpful things come to pass. I just kept my eyes open, and wow, that was a very powerful prayer. So I think if people are looking for meaning, however they can connect with people, with the universe, with God, they should just start. I think that will always go a good direction.
Okay. So at the end of this interview, I'd like to hear your thoughts on just several words I'm going to throw at you. First one is Europe.
Beautiful, cultured, the seat of almost any writer I've ever liked, and richly spiritual, and sort of searching for what that means in the modern world.
Okay, now zooming in, Germany.
My heritage, that's one thing I think. Gorgeous. Most of the best theologians who ever lived grew up there, not most, but plenty of them did. You got Luther on your side, and people like that. And kind of solid. I think of Germans, the stereotype is like really solid people who are grounded.
Okay. You mentioned Martin Luther. What do you think of him?
Oh, everyone loves Luther, and everyone's scared to death of Luther because he seems kind of scary. If you actually got to know him, you would think, ooh, he could just zing you. So a little bit of the little passion thing going, but he drank his beer, and he was passionate, and he was, he shook things up in a way that needed to be shaken up.
Wow. Revival.
I love revival, particularly if revival's open to everybody. It seems like revivals, when they go bad, are sometimes more, we want people to become us. So revival looks like you become our religious tradition, or you become whatever the markers of revival is, you've got to be it. But revival is an open-handed thing. It's just God coming to a society in a way which is beautiful and awesome. We don't quite know what it's going to look like or how it's going to work, is the thing my whole life's about.
Okay. Well, spiritual disciplines.
Awesome, except the word discipline sounds kind of like a drag. Because at least for my temperament, discipline sounds like work. Spiritual disciplines is ways to connect with God that will open up my life in a lovely way. I'm all over that. And so I'm so pleased to try to figure out ways to pray in a way that's going to connect me better, or I do a little fasting every now and again to fast in a way that's going to connect me better, or to take risks as a spiritual discipline. All that stuff sounds fantastic. Somehow just an offer God is making to me works better for me than spiritual discipline.
Well, okay. Church planting.
Well, I did it, so I'm a veteran, and I'm so pleased that I did. And I guess my hope is that church planting would happen far more widespread than it is right now. That would happen from house to house. It would happen throughout the world. Some of those would become big, hunkin' major churches, but a whole lot would just be people gathering together and trying to figure out where life can be found.
Church with a capital C.
I suppose I regard church with a capital C as anybody who's trying to follow Jesus anywhere for any reason. And I'm just thumbs up. I think they're my brothers and sisters, and I want to find ways to learn more from church with a capital C and to contribute whatever I can contribute to church with a capital C.